Welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a seriously fascinating journey ahead of us. We are going to be unpacking a really thought-provoking text by an author named Xu Feng titled The 18 Unmanageable Aspects of Life. Now, this text presents a highly specific, deeply structured worldview all about human existence, fate, and just how little control we actually have. Whether you're a hardcore believer in free will or you totally lean into the idea of destiny, this material offers a captivating lens for looking at the human experience. Let's get right into it. So let's jump in with a pretty heavy question. Did you truly choose your current life? I mean, we usually go through our days assuming we're the absolute architects of our own destinies, right? Well, the source material we're exploring today completely challenges that assumption right out of the gate. It asks us to just momentarily hit pause on our belief in total free will and consider a reality where all the major milestones of our lives are already mapped out for us. According to the philosophy of our author, Xu Feng, the answer to that question is a hard no. Our existence? It's not just a bunch of random accidents or pure personal choices. Instead, the author argues that, much like bees in a hive who are born with very specific roles, queens, workers, drones, humans are also born into a totally pre-written blueprint. Our lives, the text asserts, are purposefully designed, and we're simply walking a path that's already been paved. If you think about it, that could actually lift a lot of stress off your shoulders. If the path is already set, maybe we don't need to strive quite so frantically. All right, let's break this down chronologically, starting with Phase 1. The blueprint of birth. To really get this framework, we have to start at square one. Our identity is built on 4 completely unmanageable starting points. The text points out that we absolutely cannot control the era or the exact second we're born into. We don't get to pick our parents, and we certainly don't get to choose their bank account balance. On top of that, our genetics, whether we're tall, short, our racial background, and our innate health and baseline intellect are totally locked in. The author argues that we just have to accept these factors. There's no use blaming fate or our parents because the whole shebang is entirely out of our hands. The text makes a pretty bold claim here. It asserts that someone destined to be born into a bustling city literally cannot swap places with someone destined for the countryside. A person meant for a royal family won't be born to commoners, and vice versa. It's portrayed as this incredibly rigid system of placement where your starting line is absolutely fixed. Which brings us to Phase 2, the pre-written path. So if the starting line is fixed, what about the actual race? Well, the author uses this really vivid metaphor. A peach will always be a peach, a cherry can't become a watermelon. According to the text, your temperament, your knowledge, your appearance, and your upbringing severely limit the choices you can make. Think of it like this. A blade of grass can't just suddenly decide to be a towering oak tree, right? In the same way, the text argues a farmer can't simply will themselves into becoming a governor, and someone with zero musical talent can't force themselves to be a brilliant pianist. Building on that idea, the text paints a picture of human society as a giant flowing river, where each of us is just a single, powerless droplet. We literally can't control whether the current pushes us into the chaotic middle or safely along the quiet edge. The author believes that whether we face amazing prosperity or crushing adversity, we are largely just going with the flow of a much larger, uncontrollable current. And honestly, there's a certain comfort in that view. If you hit a rough patch, it's not necessarily a personal failure at all. It's just the current of the river. To put some real-world perspective on this, the author shares a wild anecdote from back in 1972. In a junior high school class, 48 students were asked to write down their life ideals, wanting to be pilots, doctors, sailors, or miners. 30 years later, out of those 48 students, exactly one person actually realized their childhood ideal, just one. The author uses this stark statistic to argue that the path a person takes and who they ultimately become isn't forged by their own youthful willpower, but rather by the predetermined needs of society. And this naturally brings us to the topic of wealth. Why do some people toil their entire lives just to scrape by, while others seem to make tens of thousands with just a single word? According to the text, it's not strictly about who is smarter or who works harder. It actually comes down to having a weak versus a strong wealth destiny. If wealth doesn't naturally flow to you, the author suggests it's simply not in your predetermined blueprint. Again, the takeaway the author is going for here isn't despair. It's about finding peace with where you are rather than burning yourself out in a relentless, endless chase. Moving right along to Phase 3, destined encounters and connections. Now, to prove we don't actually choose the people in our lives, the author proposes this kind of funny spouse test.
Try walking up to a totally random stranger on the street and demanding, "I've chosen you, you must marry me." Obviously, that's going to fail miserably. But the text argues that this failure proves a stark reality. We don't actually pick our spouses. The claim here is that an invisible thread draws destined matches together, and our sense of choice is merely an illusion covering up the work of fate. And then there's this very specific, almost spiritual phenomenon the author calls peach blossom luck. The text differentiates this from an ordinary marriage or unrequited love. It's described as this totally unexpected, uncontrollable, volcanic fusion between two people. You are a unique lock, and they are the absolute unique key. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's a complete fusion where 1 + 1 = 1. The source is very clear that this cannot be sought out or prevented. It literally just happens when the time and the biological signals align. But this lack of control isn't just about romance. It extends to our entire social circle. The text argues you can't just write a letter to a billionaire and force them to be your best friend. Your colleagues, they are actually pre-selected agents meant to drive you toward your predetermined life goal. Even the exact number and gender of your children are allegedly locked in from the start. And on the darker side of things, the text asserts that extreme circumstances, like self-defense or sudden crushing poverty, can push normally kind people into violence or even imprisonment. This is meant to prove that even our deepest moral boundaries can be tested by inevitable circumstances. Now, when it comes to those crazy, sudden turning points in life, the text compares it all to a game of mahjong. Your wins and losses aren't just about your technique, they're actually dictated by your position and the unseen field. The source gives some pretty wild examples of incredibly unlikely turning points. A mute boy falling into a well and suddenly being able to speak, or an abandoned baby saved from freezing by a flock of pigeons who later grows up to be a billionaire. These aren't just happy accidents, the text insists. They are destined events, striking at exactly the predetermined time. That takes us to Phase 4, the inevitable end. The author takes a completely uncompromising stance on mortality here. I mean, we all know aging and death are inevitable, right? But the text goes way further. It posits that there are over 1 million different ways to die, and your specific exit strategy is locked in. You simply can't outsmart it. The author even makes the incredibly bold claim that you cannot successfully commit suicide unless suicide is your exact predestined method of death. Otherwise, something will mysteriously intervene, or you'll pass away from another cause before you can even carry it out. To even begin to understand the mechanics behind this massive predetermined machine, the text introduces different levels of perception. We start with normal human eyes, which only see physical surfaces. Then there are scientific Dharma eyes, like Mendeley figuring out the periodic table, which see the hidden physical order of things. But culminating at the very top is the Buddha eye. According to the text, a being with the Buddha eye completely transcends time and space. They see the past, present, and future as one unified picture, and fully understand the invisible order of the entire universe. So you might be wondering, how does someone actually achieve this level of higher understanding? The text talks about sudden enlightenment, but clarifies that it's actually not sudden at all. You have to heat a pot of cold water over a fire for a long, slow time before it finally hits its limit and boils. The author shares a great little joke about a man who eats 9 buns and only feels full on the 9th one, foolishly wishing he had just eaten the last one first. The point is, true spiritual transformation requires a long, inevitable, accumulated process. You simply can't skip the first 8 buns. And finally, Phase 5, beyond the final curtain. To bridge the gap between hard science and these spiritual claims about the afterlife, the author actually points to Albert Einstein, quoting, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." The text uses this concept to suggest that the greatest scientific minds in history have already brushed up against the boundaries of that Buddha eye we talked about. It hints that what we call death in linear time might just be an illusion born entirely out of our own limited perspective. The source describes the actual event of death using a really beautiful metaphor. It's simply abandoning a boat after you've reached the other shore. That physical body, it's merely the boat. Its only mission was to carry your spiritual body across the river of life. Once you reach the other side, you abandon the vessel. It turns to dust, but the spiritual body steps onto the shore and just continues its journey into another space entirely. So where exactly does that spiritual body go? Well, according to the text, it follows a strict order based on its spiritual quality into one of 10 destined worlds. These destinations range from highly elevated, beautiful spaces like the 1,000-year world or the Elysium world,
all the way down to lower frequency existences, like the plant world or the frozen and inflamed layers. Your ultimate destination isn't just a random roll of the dice. It is the inevitable, absolute result of your lifelong spiritual cultivation. And that brings us to the end of our journey today, leaving us with a pretty profound paradox. If your life path is truly a predetermined sequence, how will you choose to experience the rest of your inevitable journey? Perhaps our true power doesn't lie in changing the path itself, but in how we perceive the walk. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.